We're talking about the future today with Perth-based and internationally renowned business futurist Gihan Perera. Global business magazine Forbes rates Gihan as the number 5 social media influencer in the world in his area of expertise, and he is Australia's number 1 business futures influencer. Gihan's work has long intrigued and inspired me, and I'm delighted to cross paths again with him and to tap into his extraordinary expertise and generosity. Today, Gihan will urge us to listen to and amplify the voices and experiences of young people, and he'll share many of the insights he talks to when he's on the global conference stage. We'll take a trip back to his childhood warm table and the ideas which formed him, and he'll also challenge us with the many lessons of our past which we need to unlearn in order to be flexible and fit for the future in a fast-changing world. I'm Sonia Nolan, and you are very welcome to join Gihan and I for a smart conversation with heart around my warm table. Gihan, welcome to my warm table, and thank you so much for your time today. It's so lovely to reconnect.
Yeah, thanks, Sonia. I've been really looking forward to this conversation.
Gihan, I'd like to start with your business title, because I believe your title is business futurist or futurist. Can you tell me what that means?
Yeah, that's right. So I've been doing this for about 10 years, Sonia, as a futurist. And you know what? Like 10 years ago, when I first started doing it, I didn't even call myself a futurist because I felt that not enough people knew what that was. I mean, futurism has been around for a while, but it's only really become mainstream in the last 3 to 5 years. So initially, when I started doing conference speaking about futurism, I didn't call it that. I said I'm a technology consultant because, of course, people want to know a lot about technology. And being a futurist is a lot more than technology. But at the time, that was something that people could kind of get a handle on. And now I feel confident that people know what a futurist is. At least they've got some idea. That they think that sometimes that I'm looking in a crystal ball and I can tell them what lotto numbers are. But even more seriously, they think that I'm predicting the future. And it's not really that. It's looking at trends and then making them relevant and meaningful for people. So quite often, what it is looking at what's already happening in the future, and that's there's a famous futurist who said the future's already here. It's just not evenly distributed.
Oh, that is so true. That is so true, Gihan. Exactly right. I actually was writing something before we started chatting, and I was thinking, I want to find out from you, what are the future trends? What can we look forward to? And then I thought, you know what? It's actually stuff that's already out there, but perhaps hasn't reached us yet.
Yeah, exactly right. And it's not only that it hasn't. So it could be that it hasn't reached us because it's happening in another part of the world. It might be with a lot of my clients, it's not yet happening in their industry, but it's happening in other industries. So I can say this is what's likely to happen. And a lot of it is just looking at trends. And so that's my day job, to be looking into the future.
Well, it sounds pretty exciting, and there's a lot to look at, isn't there, Gihan?
Yeah, there absolutely is. And over the last few years, Sonia, I've helped a lot of people look at how do they manage in this uncertain future. So it used to be that everyone wanted to know about cool gadgets. They want to know what cool technologies out there. What do I need to be aware of? But now they still want to know that, but they also want to know there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of unknown, and that's going to continue. So how do we manage and lead and navigate through that uncertainty?
It's so true. And there was a great book that I think it was written in the 70s, Future Shock.
Yes, Alvin Toffler.
You would know that book well. Yeah, that's it. And do you think we're there? Do you think we're in future shock at the moment?
Well, you know what? I think the pandemic has created a lot of shock for a lot of people. And all the way, every extreme on that spectrum or every stage on that spectrum, obviously it's been tragic for many, many, many people and families. But for even those who haven't had loss in their family, it has really been the first time that for most of us, that the whole world has been going through a crisis like this. And, Sonia, for the last 10 years, I've worked with a lot of industries that have been going through that sort of crisis and upheaval and disruption. The financial planning industry, aged care. Every year there's a new report about how it needs to be reformed. Yes. But for the first time, it's happening to everybody and happening at the same time.
So that's something that you've actually noticed quite significantly is your work since the pandemic is working with leaders and that understanding of uncertainty and crisis and rebuilding after a crisis. So what sort of pearls of wisdom can you support them with?
Well, one of the things I always say, Sonia, is that we can't give people clarity. So we can't make their lives clear for them because we don't know what their future is going to look like. So it would be negligent for us to say, here's what's going to come up in the future. But what we can give people is some confidence, and we can give them a little bit of a path ahead. So we can't say this is what the future is going to look like for sure, but we can say, here's how we can tread through this uncertainty. So it's like if you're looking ahead of you and you see a fog or a mist right in front of you. We don't know exactly what there is ahead of it, but we can know what we need to pack and how we need to tread to take that path. And the best leaders have always done this. So I have a very good friend of mine who, when she was working as a leader in the pharmaceutical industry, many, many years ago, this was Sonia, their company was going through quite a lot of upheaval. They were going through an internal reorganization, as well as there were all these things externally from regulators. And she said to her team, she said exactly the right thing. She said to her team, folks, I don't know what's coming up in the future. None of us know. But what I can promise you is that as soon as I know, I'll share it with you, and then we can figure out the future together. And that's exactly the right message for us now, that we actually don't know. So as leaders, we're expected to know, and it's an unfair expectation, but we're expected to lead, and that's a fair expectation. And it's just that a lot of leaders are now finding that they have to lead in a different way.
Yeah, very much. I used to hear a lot of the word complexity was, something that was always part of the lexicon of leaders. We're leading in complexity, we're in complex time. Now the term seems to be ambiguity. We're leading in ambiguity and uncertainty. So there's been a real change in language that I've sensed in my time in the business world just recently.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good insight there, Sonia. I think you're right. Like we have got, the term VUCA, so it's volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And I think you're quite right that in the pre-pandemic, people saw that the best leaders did see a lot of complexity in their future, and there's different ways to solve those complex problems. But now there's a lot more uncertainty and ambiguity as well. So ambiguity is like fuzzy. There's like a future's fuzzy. Uncertainty might mean that there's lots of different paths you can go on, and we're not sure which one's going to eventuate as a future, so we don't know which path to take. But you're right, there's a lot more fuzziness in the world now.
But there are some things that are not so fuzzy. So can you share with us some of the technologies and the trends that you're actually seeing that are quite clearly going to make an impact for us as we move into the next phases of our work careers or our education systems or our health systems? There's so much that's emerging. What are some of the trends that you're seeing?
Okay, so like if we're talking at that level, Sonia, and you're putting me on the spot here, but one of the things I always say is that our world is becoming fast, flat, and free. Okay, and if you think about those three words,
Okay,
fast,
what does
flat,
that
free,
mean?
and you think about the opposite of that, which is slow, bumpy, expensive. So if you're doing anything that's slow, bumpy, or expensive, then just be careful. You can do it, but do it intentionally, because otherwise you're at risk of being overtaken by somebody who's fast, flat, and free. So let's talk about fast, flat, and free. So world's become faster. Technology has made our world faster. It's allowed us to, I was laughing. I was talking to my fiance Nikki about this the other day. I said, when I watch little videos on Facebook, I get annoyed when there's a 5-second ad that's interrupting my video.
Yes.
And I grew up with 2 minutes of ads 3 or 4 times through a half-hour TV show, right? And now I get annoyed and impatient when I have to wait for 5 seconds, or 15 seconds is a lifetime. I'll just go off and watch something else.
But is that because those 2.5 minutes were productive? Because that's when you raced to the fridge and got a snack, you raced to the toilet and you did what you needed to do. So those 2.5 minutes growing up were like these really productive 2.5 minutes, but 15 seconds, my goodness.
It's crazy.
You can't start anything.
Crazy. And kids now go, well, why don't you just pause the TV show?
Like if only, those were the days.
Exactly. So that's the first thing. And technology has just made our world faster and our expectations higher when it comes to speed. I'm sure, Sonia, we know lots of young people in our lives who will never answer the phone because they want to do everything by text. There's no point a company
Yeah.
having a really good call center because they don't want to talk to somebody on the phone. They will talk to when a real estate agent advertises a property, they will send a text going, "What's the price?" And the agent, of course,
Yes.
wants to have a conversation and add them to the database and start this relationship. And they just want to know what's the price. And so it's a very different expectation. So that's the fast part of it. And that the flat is related to that as well. So we've flattened hierarchies. Nowadays, we don't have as much faith and trust in those traditional hierarchies, whether it's parents or governments or big companies. We now have, because we've got so much more access to information, we realize that some of those things, of course, they've served us well, but we don't necessarily believe that they're going to serve us well in the future. And we can connect without having to go through those hierarchies. And the third thing, of course, just to finish it off, is that we expect things to be cheap or free. I used to buy stuff. I used to own stuff. I still have a collection of CDs, which is gathering dust. But of course, we don't do that now. We pay a monthly fee to get access to movies and to music and to everything. So the whole idea of ownership is changing. Even the things that we used to buy that were physical, like books, you can now buy ebooks for a fraction of the price. So we're expecting things to be free, or at least a lot cheaper than before. This talk about big picture trends, we are becoming fast, flat, and free. And so I say anything that we're doing that's slow, bumpy, or expensive, if you're doing it intentionally because you want to provide a different experience, fantastic. But if you're doing it simply because that's the way you've always done it, then you're in trouble for the future.
Yeah, that's so wise and so insightful, Gihan, because you're talking a lot about the experiences of young people. And it's taken me back to one of the original questions I asked you when you and I were first chatting about coming on my program. And I said to you, have you got any age-old wisdom, something that you can share, we should all be doing now? And you're really quick to come back and say, hey, no, we've got to dismantle some of that old hierarchy and dismantle some of those old systems and start talking to young people and engaging them. So I'd love your take on that.
Okay, good. And so let me first start off by saying that I'm old. Okay, so I'm a Gen X. I'm a Gen X.
Oh, me
So I'm
too.
going to be I'm going to be 55 this year. And that means that I do have a whole bunch of years of experience behind me. And I really want to start off by saying that the fact that you've got all that experience and insight and wisdom, it doesn't mean that's all completely useless for the future. Not at all.
Mm.
But my warning is it's not automatically relevant for the future. And that's the difference. So I was recently speaking at a conference in Bali, Sonia, and the conference
Mm.
organizers very kindly had somebody from the conference committee who came and picked me up from the airport, took me to the venue, looked after me. And this guy was the guy that I got. I was quite lucky. I was quite a young guy. He was in his early 20s. He'd got his bachelor's degree, was thinking about doing further study, was thinking about what he was going to do in the future. And he said, as many young people say, he said, my parents have a particular path that they want me to go on. And I'm not sure whether that's right or wrong. What advice can you give me? And I said, well, first of all, you should certainly listen to their advice, but also keep in mind that they haven't traveled that future that you're going to travel. And that hasn't always been the case. So my dad was an accountant, a very good accountant. He's retired now. And when I was in high school, if I said to him, what do I need to know about being an accountant if I want to become one? I reckon the advice he would have given me about the life of an accountant would have been reasonably accurate for at least the next 10
Yes.
years. And now
Yes.
I don't think that's the case. That if you ask your parents what's the future going to look like, they're certainly going to speak from their experience and insights and wisdom. And I'm not devaluing any of that, but they don't know what that future is going to look like. And I think we've got to look at different things. And this is why I'm so, I love the attitude. I love the mindset of younger people because, these are futurists. They're people who love change. They love technology. They get bored if things aren't changing quickly enough. And yet, I think too often in workplaces and in homes and families, we're trying to mold them into mini-me's, little versions of ourselves, or at least little versions of based on our past experience, instead of learning from them and making them the leaders and creating a space for them to be leaders.
It's a really valid point, and you're making me think about. I've got friends. We're all at that stage where our children have finishing high school, going into the next phase. Some of them are going to university, and I know I was talking recently with a friend of mine, and she said, "Oh, I feel like I've let my daughter down because I was telling her about how fun university is going to be, and all the clubs you can join, and all the people around, and that experience that we'd had at university, 30 years ago." It's so different now. University is not the place of relationship connection like it used to be when perhaps you and I went, Gihan. So these kids are coming back from uni saying, "Oh, you said it was going to be all this fun and all these people, but I feel actually quite isolated and I don't know how to make friends there." And it's a very different environment to what we remember.
Yeah, exactly right. And I think, like for me, my family, I'm very grateful to my parents because they made some big sacrifice. So I was born in Sri Lanka, but we left when I was 6, and we came to Australia because of our education. So for myself, my 2 little sisters, and my brother, my parents decided to make a huge move and made some big sacrifices to come here. And as a result, we certainly didn't have a cushy life, but we had, in a lot of ways, we could build on the life that our parents gave us. But it was pretty simple at that time, Sonia. And so my parents said, what you do is you go to school, you get good marks, you go to uni, get good grades and get a good job, save up enough money for a deposit on a house, and then you're set for life. Okay. And
Yeah,
I just don't think
exactly.
that's the formula anymore. In fact, there isn't a formula. There are so many different options. So I mentioned my fiance, Nikki. So she's already got 2 kids, but they've now left home. And one of them's left home, but they've certainly finished school. And so when we're choosing what our life is going to be together, it's going to be very different. And it's up to us. There is nobody else who can tell us this is the right formula. It's up to us to create what we want to do. And that gives us a lot of freedom, but perhaps it also gives us a lot of possible pitfalls and traps. And fortunately, unfortunately, that's what the future is going to look like for us and for young people in our lives.
So what sort of things do you believe our generation, the Gen Xers of the world and and those older, what should we be unlearning so that we can actually be helpful to this next generation and we're not sort of trying to put our experiences and thoughts as the roadmap for them?
Yeah, I like that term, unlearning. I really like that, Sonia, because I think that's part of what we need to do. Again, it's building on, so we can definitely build on what we learned in the past, but some of the things that we learned aren't true anymore. They aren't relevant anymore. In fact, it was Alvin Toffler, who you mentioned earlier, with the future shock. So he
Yes.
said the illiterate of the 21st century are not those who can't read and write. They're the ones who can't learn, relearn, and unlearn. And I think it's almost anything. So you can put me on the spot and say, what about this? This is an age-old wisdom. And I can bet you I can find an exception to that and something that proves it wrong. For example, people used to say, treat people as you would like them to treat you. And I don't think that's true
Yes,
anymore.
that was the golden commandment.
That's right, the golden rule. Okay, the golden rule. But it's not true. What you should do is treat people as they would like to be treated, which is kind of different. So the way that you want to be treated doesn't necessarily mean it's the way that somebody else wants to be treated. And yet, a couple of generations ago, it was possibly true. It was much more true because everyone kind of fit that same mold. And then you could say, the way I want to be treated should be a good benchmark for how I should be treating other people. And now it's just not. Now it's understand how they want to be treated and see, and then treat them that way. So we've got things. So if you're talking about unlearning, I think anything that you think of as a traditional role is worth unlearning. It might be, what is a traditional family? Is it a nuclear family with a man and a woman and 2 kids who are married, and then they have kids together, and that's a nuclear family? Well, it's not true anymore. doesn't have to be a man and a woman. It doesn't. They don't have to be married. Their kids could come from blended families, and any of that is something that we should unlearn. So, in our family, in our extended family, my parents have got a friend whose daughter has chosen to have a child by herself. That's a family.
Of course.
If you are a couple who have a dog or dogs, that's a family. Just taking apart and just reevaluating anything that we thought of in traditional roles. We always thought that marriage was going to be a man and a woman, and now we know that's not the case. And again, like anything that it's just questioning things that you took for granted. We always thought that you'd own a car. That's not the case anymore. There are young people now who wouldn't think twice about just all the time just using rideshare. Even thinking about something like rideshare, Sonia, weren't you told as a child never get into a car with a stranger? And, and now we're doing
Absolutely.
that. And now we're doing that. But
I know.
the reason we're doing it
Yeah.
is not because we're doing unsafe behaviors. It's because there are new models of trust and driver ratings and so on. And some of the technology is making some of the security things better for us. So just question everything. And also, I think it's really important for us to listen. And I think this applies both in the professional, in the workplace, as well as at home. When I speak at a lot of conferences to a lot of different groups, Sonia, and you know what the two most common questions people ask me afterwards? Doesn't matter what industry it is,
No,
doesn't
what
matter
are
what
they?
sector, the two most common questions I get are this. Number one, what should my kids learn so that they can have a job after school? Number two, how can I get my kids to use technology less?
And that seems to go against everything that's happening in the world,
Yeah,
doesn't
and
it?
let's take the second one. So with the second one, how do you get your kids to use technology less? I say that's the wrong question. And I say,
Yeah.
don't shut off, lean in. So use that as an opportunity to find out what your kids are doing with technology. Learn with them. Learn what they're doing rather than getting them to stop what they're doing. So I have a bit of a controversial view about things like mobile phones in schools. Lots of schools ban them now because they say it gets in the way of learning. Well, actually, this is the device that they're going to use more than anything else when they're outside the classroom. We should be teaching. We should be teaching people how to use mobile phones appropriately, when's the right time to use it, when's not the right time to use it, rather than banning it, rather than shutting it off. So wherever you can, lean in because there's an opportunity for learning.
And that goes back to some of the key skills that, we're going to need, or we do need now, not just into the future, but those things about critical thinking and that discernment and choice taking so that you know what all these options are that are before us, that how to approach them safely and with clear critical thinking about whether they're the right path, and the skill of collaboration, who you're going to work with and how you're going to work with them. Are there other skills that we need to be thinking through?
Yeah, and if I can come back to the collaboration one, I think that's really important, Sonia. And this is why I think you as well, really embrace the idea and promote the idea of diversity. So there's a
Definitely.
lot of conversation now about diversity and inclusion, and some people think they're the same thing. They use them interchangeably, but they're not really.
Interchangeably,
Diversity
yeah.
is like having a whole bunch of colored textures. Inclusion is about using them, and you see a lot of organizations and teams and leaders who tick the diversity box because they think we've got a person of color, we've got couple of women in the team, and that means we've got diversity. And look, it might be that you have, but unless you tap into that diversity and use it, you haven't got the inclusion part. And coming back to something you said earlier around complexity, our world is full of complexity. We've got complex problems. We know that a disease that started in a completely different continent has now affected everybody around the world. We know that the war that's happening, that Russia's waged in Ukraine, is having an impact on what we pay for broccoli in our supermarket. So we've got complex problems and they're all interconnected. And to solve those problems, we need diverse thinking from people who've got diverse backgrounds. So I think it's not just about the color of your skin or your gender or your sexuality. it's what that means, and that means that you've got different lived experiences. I remember watching a presentation from, the last couple of years, there's been a lot of online presentations. I watched a lot of them when I was just sitting at home, and I had the chance to watch a presentation. And there was a woman who was a trans woman, and she said, if you're looking for leaders for the future, then you should be thinking about trans people. And I think she's a trans Muslim woman. She said, you should be thinking about there's no better leader than a trans Muslim woman, because we've had a lot of challenges and we've had a lot of disruption and we've had a lot of obstacles that we've had to overcome in our life. And it's not necessarily true of straight white males, as an example. So we actually need that diversity, because that brings different experience, different lived experience, which then has very different background around solving problems.
That's so true, and you've reminded me of a conversation that we've had on my warm table with someone who's neurodivergent, and she also has a disability. And she says, people talk to us about safety, and look, there's nothing that we don't know about safety, because we have to navigate our way around and understand our limitations and understand what we can achieve to the nth degree. So we're really good at safety. So you should be asking us about safety. So really fascinating points of view from lived experience, as you've just said.
Yeah, that's right. And I really like that now we're using terms like neurodiversity and even talking about education and schools. Like we used to call people who didn't fit the mainstream, we used to say they had learning difficulties. And again, we've got to be careful of our language. They've got learning differences. It doesn't mean they've got learning disabilities. We only call that difficulties or disabilities because we've created and constructed what we call the mainstream. And everybody who falls outside that, they're the people who are, if you like, abnormal in quotation marks. And that's not true. That's not true. And I think it's the idea of looking at the positives and the possibilities of people who think differently, because they bring completely different perspective into the world. So in my work, Sonia, one of the things that I recommend for leaders is I talk about this idea of reverse mentoring. You might have come across it.
Yeah, I remember you telling me about this, Gihan, some years ago.
You might have been in one of those workshops.
I was in one of those workshops, and I loved that idea. Yes, no, tell us about it. Yes, go.
Traditional mentoring is where the more senior person is the mentor. And as a more senior person, you share your experience, you share your insights, you share your wisdom, because you've got all of those. And I'm not saying you shouldn't do that, but I'm also recommending.
No, there's still a place for
that. Absolutely. And it's not an either or, it's an and. So the opposite of that is reverse mentoring, where the most senior person is mentored by the more junior person. And one of the best examples of this is one of my clients, Janet. Actually, she's retired now. She was the head of the CEO of a law firm in Brisbane, and she absolutely embraced this. So every 3 months, she'd invite somebody more junior than she to mentor her. And junior was one of three things. It could be that it was somebody who was actually literally biological age younger. It could be somebody who was newer in the firm. So it could have been quite a senior appointment, but they'd recruited him or her. Or it could be somebody who was more junior in law. So a recent graduate, because she wanted to know what universities are teaching students now. And all she would do was just have an informal coffee with them every week or two. And she created the space and gave them the permission to say, share what do you like? Anything you want to share, share what's going on in your life. And we've talked about young people and technology earlier, Sonia, but it's not only about technology. Like technology is the go-to place where many adults think, okay, we're going to ask our kids because they know about this. But it should be other things as well. What about same-sex marriage? What about Roe versus Wade? What about ownership and whether you want a 30-year mortgage and own a property, or do you want to be not tied to that? What about things like social media influence? What about influencers in general? And all of those things.
What about consumption and so many areas?
And there's so many things where we can say, give us your perspective because it's different and it's valuable and it's going to be more relevant for the future than my experience from the past.
You really inspired me after that masterclass that I took with you, Gihan. I went back to my workplace, and as a leader, what I did was looked at the younger and newer team members, and I asked them all to write just an informal email back to me, or just some dot points as to fresh eyes, what they've seen that could be improved or any first impressions of the organisation. And I continued that on in my leadership journey as to, after 3 months, I said, just write everything down, because in time to come, you won't see it in the same way. So I really want those first impressions and how things could be improved. So that, for me, was a form of reverse mentoring for me to get these fresh opinions and ideas back into, my thinking.
Yeah, I really like that, Sonia. This is a really good idea. It's a really good idea. I think many organizations, when they recruit somebody new, regardless of their age, we spend a lot of time onboarding people, which is really good. It's really good for them to understand what's happening within the organization. But I think there's a trap that you can go too far. And what you do is you mold people into what you want the organization to want of them, rather than giving them the basics to get started so they don't fall over, but then saying, share your stuff and share your experiences. I often tell this story about Nordstrom. So Nordstrom's a big high-end department store in the US. And for decades now, this is way back in the 90s, I remember first hearing this story. Last century, Sonia, in the 1990s.
I know, don't say it like that. Don't position it like last century.
So they have this external reputation as part of their brand for superior customer service. So it's like the customer's always right. Whatever you do what you can to get the customer happy. And my favorite Nordstrom story is about a customer who brought in a set of car tires and said, I want my money back. And the customer service rep said, no problem, sir, here's your money. Now, Nordstrom doesn't sell tires. But this is not about customer service, because that person knew that they would be, that the brand and the reputation they had for customer service was worth much more than what they would lose on this little bit of a transaction. And they knew that their boss would back them up. Because what happens with Nordstrom is when they hire somebody, they put a lot of work into the hiring process, but on the first day, the new employee gets a little card that says, here are the rules for Nordstrom. It goes something like this. Rule number 1, use your best judgment at all times. And then there are no other rules.
Wow.
Right? So they say,
how liberating.
We'll back you, but we want you to use good judgment. And of course, they employ the right people, and they go through that process to make sure that they get the people who they can trust their judgment. But then they say exactly that, like, just do what you, then use your best judgment and we'll back you. Now, it's not always easy for us to do that with the people we've already got in our teams, but I think that's a pretty good mantra to think for ourselves. And I often tell leaders, and this can apply to parents as well, if somebody comes to you for help, just imagine saying in your head, I trust your judgment. Sonia, I trust your judgment. Go ahead and do this. Now, that's not always appropriate to say it out loud. Okay, it's not, because there are people who perhaps don't have the right skills. They haven't been through this experience before. But at least in those situations, you can help them and then ask yourself, what am I going to do so that next time, if they come to me with the same question, I can say, I trust your judgment. And I think it's better to start with that frame of mind of saying, this is a person who is a competent adult who's going to do the right thing. They've got the right character, but they need to build judgment, and whatever that takes.
So what other skills do you think we're going to need going into the future?
So one of the things is around flexibility. So it's not only unlearning, but also being able to say, you know what, I was wrong.
There's humility. There's humility laid into that one, isn't there?
So, but there's 2 parts to this, and I want to be really clear about the 2 parts. So one is actually saying, I made a mistake. I was wrong. So there's absolutely that. And leaders need to be able to do that all the time, whether we're leading a family or a community or a team or a business. But the second part of that is that when the world changes around you, that you say the decision that I made in the past was right, but I'm not going to make the same decision now because it's wrong in these new circumstances. And we've seen this over the pandemic. We've seen this, that like early in the pandemic, I was saying absolutely need to have lockdowns and we need to stay away from each other as much as possible. But of course, when vaccines come along and new variants, which are perhaps milder or not, but when we've now we've got now that we are highly vaccinated, we're actually a different brand of human. So the decisions we made in March 2020 and the rules that we had aren't necessarily the same rules now. And I think as leaders, we tend to rely too much on past experience, and we say we made that decision, so therefore in the past, so therefore it's the right decision for the future as well. And again, I'm not saying that it's wrong, and I'm not even saying that it might not even be wrong now, but we should be willing to evaluate that decision based on, like, completely objectively. And that's difficult for us to do because as humans, we're used to building patterns. So it's very easy for us to just fall back on the patterns that we know. It's just that sometimes those patterns get us in the wrong move us in the wrong directions. We get into the trap of making wrong decisions because they're based on old data, old evidence. So that idea of being flexible without thinking and our decision making is, I think, one of the most useful skills that you can have.
I really like the way you phrase that, in the sense that the decision I made was right at the time, but now I've got new information and I've learned something different, and the world has changed, so we've got a different environment in which a decision needs to be, redirected. We're actually continually looking for evidence and scanning the environment to where the ship's going at this moment in time. It's such an important skill, the flexibility.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the things that gets in the way of that, Sonia, is just that, and again, as we get older, what happens is that people say, you get set in your ways. And that's kind of true. It's kind of true. But we also have things, like we accumulate things that we don't want to let go. So if you have a house, then you might be less likely to move and go and spend a couple of years living somewhere else. If you have a car, then you might be less likely to explore other options like public transport or cycling or walking because there's conveniences. If you've always shopped at Coles or Woolies, then you might want to continue shopping there because you know exactly what's in which aisle anytime you go in. So all of those sort of things, they kind of conspire against us. And in some ways, we've got to intentionally and consciously be willing to break those patterns. And this is, again, where younger people have an advantage because they haven't necessarily accumulated all those things from the past, which are baggage, which are holding them back from the future. I remember my stepdaughter, Abby. She's about 23 now. And when she was a few years younger, like, we used to go out to breakfast, just she and I, every month or so, just to have a catch up. And I remember once, so this is the time the Snapchat was really big. And of course, like, we used to go out for brekkie. The meal would arrive. What's the first thing that she did? Took out her phone and took a photograph.
Took a photograph.
Right? Fantastic. But, like, to her credit, then she put the phone away, and we just have an engaging conversation. But I knew she was using Snapchat, and then there I have a futurist sitting across from me. So I remember she did this once, and I said, Abs, like, what are you doing on Snapchat? Are there new filters? Is there a new feature on there? And she said to me, oh, no, we don't use Snapchat anymore. All our friends have moved to Instagram because Instagram has got this new stories feature and it's much better. And I thought, when was the last time I did something like that? To say I was using this, and if I'm a PC user, we'll switch to a Mac. If I'm an Android user, we'll switch to an iPhone, or vice versa. But for Abby, it was just second nature. Here's a better feature. Here's a new piece of software with some better features. We'll all switch to that. Also, the thing about stories. So they post stories which last online for 24 hours and then they disappear. Whereas for me, I'm just used to posting stuff, and then I want to save it and see the memories 3 years later. And from a professional viewpoint, I want to post a story and then blog it and post on LinkedIn and then turn it into a podcast and some webinar and include the story in my presentation.
Repurpose.
Yeah, exactly. And that's valuable. But it's also valuable to have that idea that I want to show my friends what's happening in the next 24 hours. And then after that, it goes. And we have a new experience.
Yeah, and I wonder, Gihan, whether there's a different definition of efficiency that we're sort of looking at. So for me, the idea of going back to what you were saying about shopping at Coles, because you know where everything is in the supermarket, so forth. For me, like, that's efficient, right? I can get in and out, do what I need to do with the shopping, and same with, car travel and all of those other things. It's sort of an efficiency that we maybe have bought ourselves in knowing what we want to do and how we want to do it. But the next generation sees efficiency in a very different way.
Yeah, tell me how they see it then, in contrast.
Well, I wonder whether they actually see, well, it's efficient for me to move to a platform that's actually going to give me what I need now rather than staying on something that I can't see adding value anymore. And it's efficient for me to be in contact with my friends and tell them what I'm doing and, the experiences I'm having in this moment because I don't need to repurpose it. So there's no point actually keeping this for
Yeah.
prosperity. So I don't know. I just wonder whether there's a different definition of efficiency that we're sort of reaching back
That's
to.
right. And I think what you've just described, Sonia, is the two ends of that two extremes of that spectrum. So one says, there's some value in what I've done in the past, so I'm going to continue doing that, and it's less efficient for me to learn something new. The other end of the other extreme is to say, I'm going to make every decision as if I've never made a decision before and reevaluate that decision. And
Mm.
obviously, there's a sweet spot somewhere in the middle in different areas of our life and different decisions we're making. There is absolutely value of in learning from our past, and we've got, with our grey hairs comes this wisdom and these insights, this experience has actually been valuable. But we've just got to be careful that it doesn't hold us back too much. A story that I often tell is about Andy Grove. He was the head of Intel in the 1970s and the 1980s. He was a president. And at that time, Intel, which is the company that makes the computer chips in your phone and laptop and so on. And there's
Mm.
two kinds of chips. So one is memory. So if you've got 64 gigabytes of data, or 64 gigabyte iPhone, that's your memory. But then there's a microprocessor chips that actually do the processing. They run your apps. And at the time,
Mhm.
Intel was a world leader in memory chips, but there were a whole bunch of other Japanese competitors who were kind of eating into their market share. And Intel was wondering, should we switch to processor chips because we can see that's got a bright future? Should we stay with memory chips because they're our cash cow and they've been really good for our past? Should we have some mix between them? And they couldn't. The board couldn't figure out what the right strategy. So Andy Grove took the president. So he was a president. He took the CEO aside and he said, "Mate, if the board sacked us and they brought in a new board, what do you think that they would do?" And Gordon Moore, who was the CEO, he said, "Oh, that's obvious. They'd get us out of memory and they'd move into processor chips." So Andy Grove said, "Okay, well, why don't we do that?" And the answer became clear to them at that point because they said, if this was an outsider coming in, if this was a stranger coming in, a clever, competent stranger, what would they do if they didn't have that history? But also knowing what the history that they did have, so they were able to have a clearer perspective, and I think that's really useful for us to do. So if we were replaced, and you could think about it the positive way. If I left and got a better job, what would my replacement do who
Mm.
was hired for that position? Or if I was sacked, or if I wanted to, even in our community, like if we saw this recently, Sonia, with a change of government. If a new government comes in,
Mm.
it's almost like you can wipe the slate clean and you can start afresh. And you can say, we've now got new climate change targets. We want to have a new relationship in the Pacific. We now want to have a new relationship with France. And it's like, because it's brand new, you've got permission to do that. You don't have to make excuses for the past. And I think it's a useful perspective, even if it doesn't happen in practice. It's a useful thought experiment to say, if somebody else came in, what would they do differently? Or if I was, even for personal decisions, I think it's really useful if you're struggling with a personal decision and you say, if my best friend had this situation, what advice would I give them?
It's a great
Yeah,
question.
and
It's a
even
great
your own
question.
advice, if you just take a step back from it, is really useful.
So, do you feel more optimistic, or do you have a few concerns about the current hierarchy and people maybe clinging to these bastions of power? And where are you sort of on the scale of optimism versus
Yeah,
concern?
look, and I think there's definitely not, like, I'm not a wildly optimistic Pollyanna that thinks that everything's going to be perfect. Like, in general, I'm pretty optimistic, but you're right. You're exactly right in describing those as people clinging on to the bastions of power, and there are these very strong hierarchies, whether they're governments, whether they're I think there's a lot of corporate hierarchy, and it's going to take some time for that to change. So yeah, there's definitely areas of concern, Sonia, and I wouldn't want to say that everything's going to be perfect because it's not. But in general, I'm quite optimistic, especially if we create a space where our younger people can thrive.
I want to take a step back, Gihan. You mentioned that you're from Sri Lanka, and I'd like to take us back to, some of the things that we like to talk about here on My Warm Table, which is who sat around your table growing up, and what are some of the ideas that have really influenced who you are now as a business futurist?
Yeah, look, one of the things that happened at our table, which was mostly in Australia because I was 6 when we left Sri Lanka, but one of the things we always had to do was we had dinner together as a family, the 6 of us, the 4 kids and my 2 parents, and there was no TV, so it was always sitting around the table and just talking about stuff. And one of the things that my parents did and they allowed us to do, which I'm grateful for, was we would have these rip-roaring arguments about stuff. And it wasn't about attacking people, but we'd have arguments about things that we disagreed with. And as kids, obviously, there were kids' topics, and as we grew older, there were more adult topics, whether it's around politics or work or different jobs and so on. And my parents were always very happy for us to have those conversations, and they created a space for that, whether they did it intentionally or they would just they just let it happen. It happened. And I remember my brother-in-law, Neil, when so he married my sister, but he used to come along to family dinners and he was shocked at these arguments. But he said it was a little bit like the Waltons. So afterwards, where we have these huge arguments and then everyone stops, we wash the dishes and it's like, good night, John boy, and everyone's happy again,
Yeah.
right? So it was a little bit like that. So, and I think that idea that creating a space for, and now I call it fierce collaboration. So you want to have people collaborating, absolutely, but the idea, and you want to have debate about topics. But what you do with fierce collaboration is you bring people in and they come in with their evidence and they argue for their point. And I'm not having an argument with you, Sonia. I'm having an argument with your perspective, and I want to see your evidence, and I want you to match it with mine. So I think in some ways that happened at our warm table. And it wasn't always warm, it's sometimes very heated, but that's okay.
It's a really hot table.
Absolutely. But that was okay. And I'm really grateful that my parents created that environment for us where we were okay with doing that. And then we were still a really strong family and have continued to be for 50 years since.
That's a great story, Gihan, and it's sort of resonating with all the things we've talked about this afternoon, that the diversity of thinking, the voices of young people coming to the table with different ways of looking at things, the opportunity to challenge, the opportunity to work together. We actually don't necessarily all hold a truth, but we all hold maybe a little element of it.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I've learned over the years, Sonia, is that just because I believe something doesn't mean it's right. Okay. And in fact, there isn't a right necessarily, but I've learned to actually like other people's perspectives, like hearing other people's opinions. And sometimes I push them and sometimes I push them inappropriately because I think other people are just as open to that as I am. And sometimes they just get annoyed. But I don't mind people pushing me to test my opinions and to test the strengths of my beliefs. But I absolutely know I'm just one of 8 billion people. It doesn't mean that I'm right. I might be very strong in my convictions, but it doesn't mean I'm right, and I'm happy to be tested.
Gihan, one of the things I've heard you say is that the future's not going to wait for you. You say it a lot more eloquently, but the future is now. It's not going to wait for you, so get on board.
And you know what, Sonia? Like nowadays, I still say that. So what I say is start before you're ready. Don't wait for all your ducks to line up in a row. Don't wait for there to be time to find space to do it and time to do it. I've been saying that for the last 10 years. For the last 2 years, I think it's had less impact when I've said it. Because
people are doing it already.
People have
they
realized
have to.
that you can't wait. We're just in this disrupted world. We're in this world that we don't know what the future brings. So pre-pandemic, it was a little bit, I wouldn't say complacent, but people were a little bit more comfortable with saying, I'll do this when I've got time. I'll do this when things settle down. I'll do this in school holidays. Now we just realize that that's not possible. We've got to get on with our lives and we've got to work towards our future, even though we don't know what that future is. I still think it's absolutely relevant to say start before you're ready. It's one thing to talk about the future and to plan for it, but until you get into it, you actually don't know how it's going to turn out.
Gihan, thank you so much for your time and your expertise and your, very warm wisdom you've shared with us today. I've really enjoyed reconnecting with you, and you always make me think, and you always leave me in a much more optimistic place of the challenges that we've got ahead of us are actually going to be something that we can all work with together and really tap into the wisdom and the flexibility and the wonderful thinking of our young people. So thank you so much for sharing that around my warm table today.
Thanks, Sonia. It's been a real pleasure. Thanks so much.
You've been listening to My Warm Table with Sonia Nolan. In Italian, a tavola calda is a warm and welcoming table where you can share big ideas, friendship, laughter and life. So much happens around the kitchen table, and I wanted to amplify it here in this podcast. My aim is to feed your mind and soul through smart conversations with heart. No topic is off limits, but good table manners rule. I hope you'll join us each week as we set the table for my extraordinary guests who will let you feast on their deep knowledge, life experiences, and wise insights. Let's keep the conversation flowing. Please subscribe to the My Warm Table podcast and share it with your friends and networks. Perhaps if they're new to podcasting, take a moment to show them how to download and subscribe so they don't miss an episode either. I'd also love you to join our community on Facebook. You'll find the group at My Warm Table Podcast. Your support is very much appreciated so that together we can eat, think, and be merry.